we're going to explore machine learning and its consequences through the concept of the social contract. This is from Green's chapter 5. So that was the chapter you were supposed to read for this week. And what I want to do is spend this first video just discussing the concept of the social contract. For some of you, this won't be new, but if you didn't emphasize political theory in your political science degree, or you don't have a political science degree going in, this might not be so familiar. And for everybody, it's kind of a refresher, you might say, and it'll help tee us up for the discussion about machine learning and the social contract. So just a couple of notes for you, just in case you want to learn more about some of the topics in this chapter. I highly recommend pretty much anything from Jaron Lanier. He is an author who was on the ground floor of the development of the public internet, who is now kind of going around arguing that you need to gain some self-control and realize that to a certain extent, to a great extent, we're being manipulated by commercial interests on the internet. You see there, one of his book titles is 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts Now. And most of his arguments revolve around wanting to free people from that manipulation, and particularly from the manipulation of doing work, unpaid work for companies, basically who want to mine our data in order to further manipulate our buying habits. Okay, so that's Jaron Lanier. And then I'll also recommend Williams and Schrinch. I can never pronounce that guy's name, but Schrichek on left accelerationism, #accelerate, which you can actually just Google that. Most of this content is on the web. And they are left accelerationists. So they are making the argument that sort of contrary, completely the opposite of Lanier in a way, that we have to go through this phase of commercial development and really the abuse of technology to a great extent in order to get to the other side. So these are technology accelerationists in the sense that they believe that technology will save us and that the current development is well worth it, and that we will get to the other side and may not even need to work in a future high-tech society, and a lot of our problems will be solved, such as our environmental problems. So if you want to get the full technology accelerationist vision, you can go there. All right, but today I want to get into this concept of the social contract. What is a social contract? We've probably all experienced signing a contract, agreeing to terms and feeling bound by them. Signing a contract is usually feels like a big deal because you are making a commitment, and you're saying in writing, I commit to doing this, and the other party is committed to doing this in exchange. And you know that if you fail to do this, your end of it, there may be consequences for you. It is a legal contract and usually a legal document, and so it may have legal consequences. When we talk about the social contract, we're not talking about the exact same thing, but we are talking about people making a commitment, making commitments to do certain actions and obey certain rules in order to receive certain goods in exchange. So it retains this idea of reciprocity, okay? And here we're going to talk specifically about the so-called liberal social contract, which is the social contract idea that we would be most familiar with in the United States. And in much of the rest of the world, there is this concept of people forming government in order to serve certain ends that they had or have, okay? And so I want to go back and take a look at original social contract theory through these three authors. Hobbes and Locke, early social contract thinkers who are similar in some ways, different in others. And then John Rawls, a 20th century thinker who builds on liberal social contract theory and updates it or attempts to update it for today. Some of liberalism's basic elements, which we need to keep in mind, and I'm sure these are familiar, are that individuals are the primary actors and decision makers. They are the ones that, quote, sign the social contract, that agree to the social contract. The assumption is that individuals act in their rational self-interest. The liberal assumption is that individuals act in their self-interest. And typically, they argue that they are capable of acting in their long-term individual self-interest. Okay. Also, liberalism assumes that people have inalienable rights, that we are born with certain rights. Liberal theories differ on what those rights are, but they are inherent to the human being. They cannot be simply decided away. They can certainly be violated, but then that creates an argument for doing something to gain the ability to exercise those rights. And then finally, liberal social contract theory typically endorses the idea of the right to private property in particular, and private property being a fairly fundamental concept in the development of the original liberal social contract thinking. Okay. And I'll explain why in a bit. So first, let's just talk about Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was a 17th century English political philosopher. He originated the modern social contract thinking. We can trace social contract thinking all the way back to Plato and probably earlier, actually. But the modern social contract thinking is distinguished by this notion that we can do this very scientifically and that we can create an order that will be lasting because it will make the most sense for all people at all times. Pretty tall order, but yes, Hobbes is a pre-Enlightenment thinker. Locke is a little bit closer, and he's in the Enlightenment, the early Enlightenment. So that's the difference, I guess, right? The aspirations of the Enlightenment philosophers. Okay, so Hobbes. Hobbes posited a scenario, and all social contract thinkers do. They try to characterize people as they really are when stripped of their current context, government, law, culture, and so on. Hobbes called this the natural condition of mankind. And he said that, and this was conditioned by his understanding of human nature, he said that the natural condition of mankind with no government, what people will act like if there is no government in charge, is one of deep mistrust. People aren't mind readers. They can't know what's in another person's head. And they must assume the worst because they are self-interested. They want to survive. And so they must assume the worst and protect themselves against anyone who might want to harm them or take something that they need to survive. And that's going to mean that they have to preempt violence against them with violence. So Hobbes said that the natural condition of mankind would lead to a life that is, quote, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay. In other words, you're likely to get killed and you're likely to die a painful, violent death in this situation. So he's putting a high consideration on government. Government is the only thing in Hobbes's view that is standing between us and total, utter chaos. So he then argues that to have what he calls commodious living, which is just, peace, safety, possibly prosperity, because the two go together in his view. People must have government, and it must be a strong government. It cannot be a democracy or anything like it, because that's not strong enough. We don't want people to argue, because that will lead back. Social conflict will lead back to a state of nature. So we will each agree with each other to get out of this dire situation. He says we would naturally agree with each other to submit to a sovereign power, and that sovereign power, we would consent to it being absolute. And we would concede all of our natural rights. Now, really, the only one that he recognizes is the right to self-preservation. So we would concede this, sort of, okay, to government. As long as government can protect our lives, we have to allow it to do so. Now, the reason why I say sort of is because in Hobbes, to be consistent, has to say if government isn't able to protect your life, then you definitely have a right to protect it yourself. Okay. However, under normal conditions, you cannot take the law into your own hands, because you have created this powerful government to protect you. Okay, so he actually argues that the social contract will lead to absolute monarchy. So Hobbes is creating a popular argument, a popular rationale for absolute monarchy. This was an argument that theoretically had traction, okay, but didn't practically have any traction, because the people of his day, he lived during the times of the English Civil Wars, Oliver Cromwell, and all of that. Um, Life was not easy in his native country during those times. And so, he was reacting to all that, and he didn't like the violence. But the reason why people were fighting was because there were strong elements in English society that wanted more popular government, that wanted more say in their government, didn't want to obey an absolute sovereign. And those forces were not going to go away. He didn't foresee how powerful the commercial forces were that were leading to a larger merchant class. Um, he just didn't quite understand. He didn't take a good read of his times, I guess you might say. All right. But the structure of the social contract that he developed did have legs. It did have a lot of traction. Okay. So while he said that the alternative to a powerful government is chaos, um, and that, Locke would come along and say, nope, that is not the only alternative. Okay, so let's turn to John Locke. Locke is more associated with the development of constitutional monarchy and a more popular form of government. He came along really just a generation later, late 17th, mid to late 17th century thinker. Originally agreed 100% with Hobbes about absolute monarchy, probably for a lot of the same reasons. But then he got associated with the Whig Party, and he began to work for a wealthy family associated with the Whig Party, and they were less conservative, okay? And they tended to represent this up and coming rising bourgeois class, okay? And he had a better read of the times, that these were movements based in technology and economics that could not be ignored. And so he turned the social contract theory towards a justification for a modified form of government, a constitutional monarchy. To do this, he had to change the natural condition of mankind scenario. The state of nature for Locke is not the same as it is for Hobbes. Locke imagined a state of nature in which, yes, life is rough, because there's not a lot of, there's no government to kind of protect people's agreements and their property. However, people are not so bad and not so mistrustful. He recognized a little bit more of a social nature on the part of human beings. They could cooperate. They could have each other's back to a certain extent, especially families. And people would form groups of families and I guess what we would call friends, and they would be able to protect each other in this sort of rough and ready justice um, that was meted out by each individual or each family or grouping. Okay. Now, the reason why this still was inconvenient for Locke, he called it inconvenient, which is not the same as Hobbes's poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's inconvenient and not the best because of the fact that everybody is defending themselves and they are he says, the judge in their own case. And when you're a judge in your own case, when you're deciding, oh, the fact that you stole my chicken from my property is a capital offense because I think so. Well, that leads to more conflict. That's upsets the balance of things. So Locke's state of nature was, in his view, prone to feuding and disputes that could interfere with the relative peace, the sort of rough and ready justice. Okay. And also, and this was very important, Locke could see that property rights were so important for this growing, what came to be the capitalist class, and that they could not grow their property, whether it was in land or in any other capacity. They couldn't grow their property very far without something bigger than the family or the grouping being able to protect it. Money, he imagined, could be developed in a state of nature, but you couldn't use money very effectively because you couldn't pile up very much of it because somebody could come along and steal it from you fairly easily. But also, you couldn't use your money to buy more property for the same reason. How far could your individual or family or grouping extend its protection powers out? How many acres could it do that? Well, not that many, according to Locke. You need a police force and a military for that. So he argued that people would see the reason in establishing a social contract to provide this protection so that they could accumulate more money and more property, and that this would be something that would be good for all to do. Okay. In the state of nature, people can use whatever they can use, but there's only so much you can use. Much of it will deteriorate, okay, whether it's meat or, food of any kind. Much of it could be stolen by others. So there's only so much you can use. But if you have government, then you can use these things much more productively. He had in mind the fact that farming was changing at this time from very low scale peasant farming on common land to like land being sectioned off and enclosed into these private farms that were being farmed by tenant farmers too. So he had this in mind. This was going on and it was changing and transforming the economy as he wrote. And his question was, what kind of government can protect this new commercial enterprise, all this farming and all this business that's developing? All right. So he said it is a contract that recognizes a lot more than just the need for us to protect our rights, our life. That's very important. Um, but it has to be much more than that. It has to protect our ability to have private property, um, to act as a citizen, to speak and worship as we please, and to publish the ideas that we have. In other words, it's much closer to the liberal social contract idea that we know now. Okay. How does he justify this change? Well, he says, look, people in the state of nature kind of have it rough and there's probably lots of feuds. However, if you have to choose between that state of nature and a tyrannical absolute monarchy, it's rational to choose the state of nature. It would be better to return the state of nature. So he develops this idea that people can rebel against the tyrannical sovereign and that they can return to a state of nature, which to him meant to revolt and to establish a new form of government that can protect all of the rights that he thought they had, natural rights, okay, the type of liberties that now are commonly expressed in liberal democracies, okay? So he said government, in order to be legitimate, has to protect all those rights. It has to be representative. So the parliament is not just going to be a rubber stamp parliament, which is what Hobbes would have liked, if not just get rid of it altogether, but it is actually the most powerful institution in Locke's preferred civil society. Okay. Legislative supremacy is what he posited. He was not the author of checks and balances, actually. Yes, divided powers, but not checks and balances. We get that from the American founders. All right, so Locke was very much about the government reflecting the will of the majority and protecting the rights of all. Here's a paragraph from the second treatise of government on his cautions and what, he's saying what citizens and parliament needs to do to prevent tyranny from happening. He says, if a long train of actions show the councils all tending that way towards tyranny, how can a man any more hinder himself from being persuaded in his own mind which way things are going, or from casting about how to save himself, than he could from believing that the captain of a ship he was in was carrying him and the rest of the company to Algiers, when he found him always steering that course through crosswinds, leaks in his ship, and want of men and provisions did often force him to turn his course another way for some time, which he steadily returned to again as soon as wind, weather, and other circumstances would let him. That's a fancy way of saying, if your common sense tells you that your government is taking steps that are going to lead to the loss of your individual rights and freedoms, then even though occasionally the government seems to act otherwise or says something to try to calm people down, they need to actually recognize steps towards tyranny and take action against it. So Locke, of course, establishes the right to revolution. Okay. Keep Locke's ideas in mind when we're talking about this, the technology issue, because I think this is the ideology that is in people's heads when they're uncomfortable with this, too much machine learning governance. Okay, all right. Finally, just a little bit about Rawls, and then I'll finish this one up. Rawls updates Lockean liberal social contract theory with more social justice, more social welfare. It even is a theory that could justify social democracy or democratic socialism. So what he does to get there is his state of nature is imagined behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. We're still dealing with individuals, but they're individuals that somehow don't have a memory, have lost their memory of where they came from. Imagine if you didn't know, what gender you were, what race you were, what country you were born into, your health condition, your socioeconomic status, none of that stuff. All you know is that whatever government you agree to with everybody else in your social contract is going to become what you are going to live under, given the status you had before you started this. So you in this situation, you would think, well, gosh, what if I get dropped back into society and I'm poor? I'm from a minority class. I'm a female, or a non-binary person. What's my life going to be like? Oh, I'd better create a form of government here with my fellow contractors that will protect me, even if I'm sort of on the lower end of the societal status, right? And that will try to fix those inequalities and those prejudices. So that's exactly what Rawls posits, is that under those conditions, people will choose a government that and an economy that will be best for all people, regardless of their position when they return. Okay. So Rawls' theory paves the way for the liberal justification of at least the welfare state, and I'm sure how you could see perhaps even democratic socialism. This doesn't really change the social contract thinking at its very core all that much, but it shows the flexibility of social contract thinking, and it is also a set of ideas that we're somewhat familiar with already, hopefully, and so you should also keep this idea in mind, Rawls' idea of the social contract in mind, as we study the impact of machine learning on local governance.